These people are high-functioning, normal, adjusted humans.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring research and practice in channeling. My guest, Dr. Helané Wahbeh, is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. She is both a researcher and a practitioner of channeling, as well as a naturopathic physician. And now, I'll switch over to the internet video. You have a very extensive background, both as a researcher, as a clinical practitioner, and as an experiencer of channeling.
Yes, thank you. I do come from an eclectic background. Growing up, I always was fascinated by health and medicine, and especially how our moods and mental states influenced our health. And so I ended up going to naturopathic medical school to become a physician. And naturopathic doctors are trained as general practitioners. We have a different philosophy that guides our healing practice, one that believes the body has its own innate ability to heal itself. We focus on prevention, on getting at the root cause, doing least harm. And so with that philosophy, we have a big tool bag that we use to help people move along their path of optimal health, whatever that looks like for them. So that's my clinical training and background. And I got out of medical school and started private practice and was focused on mind-body medicine and incorporated meditation quite a bit into my clinical practice. Before I had gone to medical school, I actually had a little dabbling into research. And so as I continued in clinical practice, I kept hearing the call of research again in the back of my mind, and had an incredible opportunity to do some post-doctoral research fellowships, specifically around mind-body medicine. And my research focus was with mindfulness meditation and with combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. So it was really at this intersection of meditation and trauma. I was very fortunate to receive a National Institute of Health's grant to do that work, and discovered incredible things about how the way we perceive our symptoms, our discomfort in our body can really be shifted from the practice of meditation. So that was really incredible work. In parallel, I have a fascinating background with, as you said, experiencing, or as an experiencer. I went to my first seance when I was 10 years old, actually at my grandparents' house. And I come from a long line of individuals who do something that we call channeling. And so I witnessed my grandmother doing this, my uncle, everybody in my mom's side of the family has some capacity to channel. And I can talk a lot more about how I define that and what that means exactly. So as a child, it was a little frightening to me because there wasn't any lead-in into that experience. My mom just brought me to this meeting, and there was this large group. It was about 40 people, and they were sitting in a circle, and, all of a sudden my grandmother's speaking in this very different voice, or my uncle speaking in this very different voice and speaking about stuff they would never normally talk about. So my little girl self was like, oh, can this happen to me? Like, am I going to just automatically start talking in these strange voices? So obviously I grew up and learned and discovered that I had my own capacity to do channeling. And that really supported me in so many ways personally, and has, supported my life greatly. And yet, with my clinical background and academic background, that was completely taboo. And so I kept those two aspects of my life very, very separate.
Well, now you have already conducted quite a bit of research on altered states of consciousness, meditation, all kinds of physiological measures. And I know you've also done a survey of people who do channeling. And as I recall, one of the findings that you came up with is that almost universally people who engage in channeling regard it as a positive benefit in their lives.
Absolutely. One of the questions we ask people is, what is the impact of these experiences on your life? From very negative to very positive, and across the board in the many different populations we've looked at, it is definitely in the very positive category.
Because I would imagine that there aren't mental hospitals the way there used to be, huge warehouse-like institutions across the country. I used to work in one, but one has the impression that a lot of people who engage in channeling don't integrate it well into their life and could easily end up with a diagnosis of psychosis.
Yes. I think there is this perception that people who channel have some sort of dissociative identity disorder or some sort of mental pathology. And we've done a number of surveys looking at that. And what we have found that in general, people who do mediumship or channeling don't have pathological levels of dissociation or psychosis, while their scores might be slightly higher than our control groups. Those like raw scores don't actually reach any sort of clinical cutoff that a psychologist or psychiatrist might say, okay, you have a mental illness. The other interesting piece is that they're highly functional in their lives. So, there have been a number of studies, ours and others in Brazil, looking at functionality and the ability to integrate into their lives. And it's really quite positive. These people are high functioning, normal, adjusted humans. There are, of course, outliers. So there's the people who have very intense, strong experiences that happen frequently, or they don't have a good support system or a context for their experiences. And those are the few people in our surveys that we find that have higher values on their dissociation or psychosis scores.
Could you talk a bit about how you actually got started, your first experience channeling?
So my channeling has taken different forms. So the way I describe channeling, and as we do at IONS, is I think a little broader than some people might define it as. So I'd like to just share about that. So we define channeling as the ability to access information and energy from beyond our conventional notions of time and space. So this is a really broad umbrella term for accessing this information and energy. And so we believe that everyone has the capacity to do this, but that the way that manifests from them is very unique. And we know these experiences exist on a spectrum, right? So on one side, you might have things like intuition or gut hunches that people experience, very commonly. Everyone might say, oh yeah, I've had a gut hunch, just knowing something that I couldn't possibly know. And then on the other side of this spectrum, you might have things like trance channeling, where the channeler believes that they are acting as a vehicle for a discarnate being to communicate, using their body directly to communicate. And there's all those things in between. And people have described different terms to all of these various experiences: clairvoyance, clairaudience, mediumship, channeling. The list goes on and on. And so one thing actually we're doing at IONS is really exploring what is the variety, what is the diversity of people's experiences of this channeling or this noetic experiences. So when I first went to the seance at my grandparents' house, it just opened me up to this incredible sense of knowingness. I started exploring for myself and being curious about my own felt sense of what was beyond my physical body. And I began playing with a variety of techniques like applied kinesiology, pendulums, tarot cards, all these, kind of interesting, unique ways to tune in, if you will, to information and energy beyond our traditional five senses. And that developed over time such that I had a very strong clairsentience capacity, where I would have a sense in my body of something that is just true. Or let's say I was given a choice between one thing and another, and I would sit quietly, get into a meditative state, and ask which is the way to go. And I would feel in my body, like with, goosebumps and an expanded sense of which way is the best way to go. I also experienced claircognizance, where I would just receive. The way I experience it is like packets of information that I wouldn't necessarily have known otherwise. We could talk for hours about what the source of this information is, but I'll just speak to my felt experience of it. I then, had the opportunity to be able to come work at IONS at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and that was almost 4 years ago now. And at that point, it really allowed me to bring together these two aspects of my life and apply, scientific method to be able to ask questions and learn about this phenomenon and how it works and how it manifests and how we could perhaps use it to support ourselves.
Well, you started out in a seance. That was your first experience. So I presume your mother's side of the family were spiritualists. That's where the term seance is typically used. Did you ever experience that type of trance channeling that would occur in a seance?
My family was actually Orthodox Christian, so it was a very Christian background, and they wouldn't call themselves spiritualists, and they would never have used the term seance. That was the term that I used to make it easy for people to understand. They just called it meeting. We're going to have a meeting. And my grandfather wrote a book called Life After Death, where he did all these case studies of, exorcisms and trance channelings and all these unique experiences that he collected through his life. And this was kind of an unfoldment of his personal work. And so included in those meetings were trance channeling of my grandmother, who had her first experience when she was 16. My grandfather was taking her around to one of these people's homes that he heard they were having this spiritual experiences, and she just went into a trance. So he's like, oh, great, now I can study my wife. And then, they found their son, my uncle, was also a very strong trance channel. And so he became the star of the show, if you will, and would hold an audience. People would ask questions. And then the term that was used for the purported discarnate beings that were speaking through him was called the universal mind. So they called it the universal mind, and he did automatic writing and wrote a book in this channeled state. He was actually studied with some of the work done at John F. Kennedy University here on psychokinesis, and participated in some of those studies as well.
How interesting. I used to teach there.
Okay, yeah. Back in the 80s, there was a PK program, and he was one of the participants in that.
Yeah, I wasn't part of that program. As I recall, it was run by Julian Isaac.
Yes.
But this was your uncle who was part of that program?
Yeah.
How interesting. Well, I might have rubbed shoulders with him at some point.
Yes, I've actually.
So
go ahead.
Well, I presume that from what you're saying that you yourself haven't done trance channeling.
So that's why I was bringing in ions. So, of course, when I came to ions, I had the opportunity to build on the work that IONS has already done to build this channeling research program. So we have this formal research program where we're asking, 6 questions about channeling and doing a variety of experiments on channeling. Through that, I ran into a couple protocols using hypnosis to learn how to trance channel. Patricio Trisoldi, who you probably know in Italy, has been piloting this, and we did our own pilot here at IONS. There's also another group called Dira International in Oman who does a similar method. So I was fascinated. Could I actually do the trance channeling, considering that's been in my family and I've witnessed it and I'm also studying it? So I went through this procedure myself and am now able to trance channel. And so I learned that about, 6 to 8 months ago, and can actually do it myself now, which is fascinating.
And it's a relatively new experience for you to do it at that level.
It is. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
How exciting, Helane. That's very exciting.
Yes.
I can imagine you are probably have in your own mind like 100 questions about where can I take this now? Yes,
absolutely. And, I think that was a little bit of my hesitation and trepidation, because I have the scientist mind that won't be quiet. It's like, oh, what about this? And what about that? And we need to ask this. And there is a level of sort of surrender or stepping out of the way, like with many, transcendent practices, to be able to quiet that part of ourselves. So yes, it does open up a whole new level of inquiry. One piece that it's opened up quite a bit for me is this concept around who actually can channel and in what way. And, I had the hypothesis, if you will, that there was some genetic component to the type of channeling you could do, and that perhaps the trance channeling required some genetic piece, because we could see how it went through families. And, I'm seeing in these other groups that they feel that they can teach anybody to do trance channeling. And so I think this is just the beginning of a more formal evaluation of whether that's true or not. We do have a number of genetic studies that we're also doing here at IONS to see if we can see any differences between psychics and controls and their genetic profiles, if you will.
Well, that would be fascinating. I do have the impression that some of these skills run in families, but of course that brings up the whole nature versus nurture debate. It's hard to know, what part of it might be genetic. But let me ask you this question. I have a good friend I've known for decades, Kevin Ryerson, a famous trance channeler. And Kevin, when he goes into trance, and I've watched him do it many times, goes into an altered state of consciousness. And when he comes out of the trance, he has almost no memory of what transpired, what took place. That's why he records it, so he can listen to the recording if he wants to. Was that your experience as well in trance, that you didn't remember what took place when you came out?
My experience of it is that I'm an observer. It's almost like I step aside and I'm observing the experience. So I can witness it as it's unfolding. But then a week later, if you asked me, do you remember what was said? I won't have a memory of it. And so I also will record it. And this is a common in all the channelers that I've spoken to and through our studies. We ask them to rate two scales. One is this level of incorporation. How much do they feel that, I'm going to keep saying purported discarnate being is actually in their, using their body on a scale of 0 to 100. And the other is the level of their consciousness in terms of their awareness of what's happening, 0 to 100. And it is rare for us these days to find trance channelers who are completely not aware. My grandmother was like that. Your friend you just mentioned is like that. I just learned of another person who is like that. But all the other channelers I've connected with do have some level of awareness during the process itself.
Now, I know you've done physiological studies as well, and the striking finding that you've reported is that channelers, while in trance, didn't show the sorts of physiological changes you had imagined that they would.
Yes, that was very surprising to me, and I don't know if you've witnessed trance channelers. They look quite different. Their vocalizations are different. Their manners are different. And I had imagined that we would see a shift in the EEG or the EKG or something. And there was no change. Now, why is that? We're not really sure but we have some thoughts. One is that the way we set up the study design was 5 minutes channeling, 5 minutes no channeling, and then repeating that 3 times. So the channeler was basically going in and out of a channeling state quickly. So does that quick transition sort of create more of an average state over the different conditions. That's one thought. The other thought, the channelers were quite surprised that they couldn't speak, because normally when they channel, the being comes in and they're actually talking. And we said, no, you can't talk because we need to have a clean EEG signal. And so perhaps because of that difference from their normal state, we didn't see a shift in the EEG. What's fascinating is we had a channeler channel about why we didn't see a change. And they said, well, you should have asked us before, because we would have told you that there wouldn't be a shift. Because in order for the purported discarnate being to speak through, they need to align with the channeler. And part of that is adjusting to their physiology. Now, we are going to look at different analyses. Like what we did was just the simple frequency analysis of EEG, like alpha, theta, beta, etc. So we're going to do some coherence analysis and interconnectivity analysis of the EEG as well. And we did see a shift in the voice. So we did a frequency analysis of the voice, and that was different as well.
So at some point you did ask them to speak.
Yes, we did. And so at the end of the full, 6 switches, they had an opportunity to give a message about the research or anything else that they wanted to share. And we actually, the paper that describes the qualitative analysis of those messages is under review right now.
I see. Well, you've also done quite a bit of research in meditation. You're a long-term practitioner. How would you compare meditation versus channeling?
I feel like the state that I get into during meditation is very similar to the state that I hold during channeling. It is a place for me of stillness, of expansion, of blurred boundaries, if you will, of myself and what's around me, a sense of timelessness and spacelessness. And it's also quite blissful and joyful. We did a systematic review on transcendent states during meditation, and it's often described very similarly, this state of oneness or samadhi or transcendent state, this expanded, ineffable state that's accompanied by bliss and joy. So my meditation practice that has allowed me to be able to be in that state has supported me to, I think, learn the trance channeling, and I find they're quite similar.
But of course, there are many studies now, maybe 1,000, showing all sorts of physiological changes that occur during meditation.
Right. So again, I was surprised we didn't see it in the trance channeling.
Of course, that was one study. Maybe in a different study, it'll show up. Who knows?
Yes. We had some, channeling researchers contact us and say, oh, but you didn't do it this way, or you didn't try this measure, and oh, you need to do it like this. So there's definitely more, like with all research, there's so many different ways that you can attempt to answer a research question.
Now, I've done a number of interviews on dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder. In fact, as I recall, I first learned about it from a book published by the Institute of Noetic Sciences decades ago, in which they cited research that showed that studies of people with this particular condition, where the personality shifts, showed on occasion dramatic physiological changes, including the color of the eyes might might even change. And it seems to me that when I read that research, my gosh, maybe these people are actually acting as mediums if they have such profound physiological changes. But I gather that the research doesn't really support that. People with dissociative identity disorder don't particularly come up with afterlife evidence. Channelers, at least those who operate in a spiritualistic context, seem to do so.
Yes, this is true. The themes that we hear from the messages coming through are quite similar. You know, what is our true nature as humans? How do we awaken humanity to that true nature? And various tricks and tips to help humans do that. And a consistent message of love. There's also some feedback about research and how to do research, and yet most of it comes through this filter of supporting humanity to wake up to our true nature and be in a state of love. That's just very simplistic, but just distilling the core messages that we hear from most of the channelers.
There's actually, to my knowledge, there must be 1,000 books published by channelers with all of this information.
Yes.
It would fill a library.
Yes.
Just of channeled works, including, I suppose, religious scriptures.
Absolutely. That's one of my dream projects, is to do a systematic review of all that channeled material from channelers all over the world, different traditions, and pull out the common themes and see what are the commonalities, what are the differences, are they saying the same thing? I think that would be a fascinating study.
Yeah. Now, many years ago, John Climo wrote his book called Channeling. It was really, to my knowledge, the first academic attempt to understand what's going on. And I thought, for that era was a very credible book.
Yes.
And one of the points that he made or explored, I think, quite a bit in that book was the idea that what's really going on in channeling is people are getting in touch with their own higher self. He called it channeling the higher self.
Right.
In effect, there's the depths to our own consciousness. What we call the higher self, we have no idea what its boundaries are. It could extend to infinity. Yeah. Exactly.
Yes. When we talk about what is the source of this channeled information, is it part of ourselves? Is it a distinct separate entity? How can we actually verify what the source is? You hear about channelers who are channeling beings from different systems, the Pleiades, and so in my work, I try to just set that aside, if you will, and say, we can't really prove that in this moment. So rather than focusing on the proof of what the source is, let's focus on the phenomenology and the functionality, and could we actually use it as a tool to support us? That being said, if we are all one, if we are all interconnected, and, we are connected to everything that is, then yes, I could be channeling my higher self, and that higher self is connected to everything else and has ability to tap into an infinite source of information and energy that could support me.
When I think about, for people who channel aliens, for example, and my friend Angela Thompson-Smith, who is a remote viewer, has a book about her remote viewing contacts with about a dozen different alien species. I suppose that would fit into your definition of channeling.
Yes.
It dawns on me, from astronomy, we know there are 1 trillion galaxies out there. Each galaxy could have billions of populated planets. So I think the human brain is not really capable of absorbing the immensity of what is out there, what might be accessible to, we could call it the higher self.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, considering all that you just shared, the likelihood that there is something else out there is very, very high, in my opinion.
And I do think it's interesting from a sociological point of view that there's some community of channelers who are really into aliens. There are other communities that are really into communication with the deceased. There are other channelers who like to channel devas or deities or the orishas of candomblé and Latin American cultures. It almost seems from the descriptions that we're talking about 3 different categories of entities that are different than living humans.
Yes. I did a full trance channeling focus group with 5 channelers in Mount Shasta, and I think we had 21 different purported beings that came in from, it was like 5 different systems, everything that you've just described. And what I found fascinating, one of the questions I asked is, how can, this channeler in this country say, oh, I'm channeling Mary or Jesus, and then another channeler says that they're channeling the same beings, right? How can this be happening? And the answer was to maximize the messages to come through. It is coming through many different people, and that there's the terms of energy and frequency. So the frequency of the being, if you will, connecting with the frequency of the channeler and the frequency of the message creates this infinite number of combinations for the audience. So in order to get the messages out to all these audiences, then you have all these unique combinations of being able to express it. So yes, you have these different groups of sources that are coming through these different channelers. You'll also might find interesting that there's a lot more group channeling happening, where channelers will actually, instead of just being this lone channeler doing their work, they'll work with other channelers, and then they will, as they're channeling, communicate with this other channeler who's also channeling. So there's this sort of like multi-dimensional dialogue that's happening, which is incredibly fascinating to think about.
Well, I was part of such a group at one time. Many, many years ago, I was invited by a chiropractor named Dr. Richard Girac, who lived in the Bay Area. And he pulled together a group of people, and he'd put everybody into a hypnotic state. And then he'd say something like, why don't we all go, now we'll fly together, we'll go to Marine World Africa, USA. Let's see if we can find a dolphin in the dolphin tank. And one person would say, yes, I'm at the tank now and I'm approaching a dolphin. And someone would say, yes, it's a female dolphin. And another person would say, and her name is D, or it begins with D. And another person would say, yes, and she's sad and she's all by herself and she's not cooperating with the dolphin trainers. And so a whole picture comes together that way. Much, I suppose you could say, the way a professional remote viewer will go back again and again and again to the target A single individual could do it. But in this case, it was a group. And actually, we called after that session, we phoned Africa Marine World USA and asked them if they had a dolphin like that. And they said, oh, as a matter of fact, there's a female dolphin named Dondi who is separated from all the other dolphins and is cantankerous and won't cooperate. And in fact, the message we got in our hypnotic session was she wants us to help her escape. And But our group went out there to Africa Marine World and began doing some telepathy experiments with the dolphin trainers and with Dondi, and her health and her condition improved so much that I don't know if this is a good outcome or not, but the dolphin trainers were happy because she joined the other dolphins and became a regular part of the dolphin show that they had there.
That's fantastic. I love that story. It's such a beautiful example of the synergy that can happen when people are in a group doing this work, because I think it strengthens the connection with each other, but also makes it easier for whatever information is wanting to come through. Of
course, the supportive social environment, I should think, is really crucial. I'm sure it's the case for you if you go out and speak. Every parapsychologist that I know, when we speak in public, people come up and they want to share their stories because they don't feel that it's safe to share with their family or friend.
Yes, absolutely. This happens all the time. I get emails after every talk, the person will come up and whisper in my ear, I had this experience and I haven't told anybody. I find it quite fascinating that there is such a taboo and fear around sharing about this, and yet it is clearly so common. There's this misconception that it's rare and unique and bizarre, and yet it's actually quite common that people have some form of channeling experiences at least once in their life. So I'm grateful for you and your show for, bringing and spreading out the word that actually this does exist on some level. People experience it, and how do we learn more about it?
You did this survey, and as I recall, you found that 80 to 90% of people report that they've had some experience akin to channeling.
That's right. We surveyed it was 899 people. So we contracted with a survey company that randomly selected people from around the United States. So it wasn't just like it was the IONS membership, although it was split out into 3 groups. One was people from the general population, one was scientists and engineers, and the other was more selected to our IONS group. And so because of the taboos that we see in academia, we thought, of course, the scientists and engineers are going to have much lower experiences. And we found that that wasn't the case, that the general population and the scientists and engineers had the same level of prevalence of these experiences. We asked them about 25 different types of channeling experiences, and it was in the mid to high 80% of those people had at least one. And we're like, wow, this is really high. Let's look at our questions and the way we asked them to make sure that they weren't misconstrued in some way to be just normal empathy or normal hunches. And we took out the top, I think it was 4 or 5 that we thought, okay, maybe they misconstrued this, and it was still in the 80s. So this is a common experience, even amongst scientists and engineers, even though they may not ever admit to it.
I think another aspect of channeling, which is really important actually, is to look at what are the known cultural effects of channeling right now. And I think we've already talked about religious scriptures, but you can look at some of the great literature that's been written. For example, W.B. Yeats, a Nobel laureate poet, wrote a book called A Vision, in which he described his wife going into trance and providing him with a very complex mythological structure that became the basis of a lot of his poetry.
Yes, and you think of Kukuli and the ring structure. That was, like a channeled dream. He saw the Ouroboros and the snake eating its tail. We could come up with so many examples of channeled material and how it influences our lives.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if that also applies to scientific inventions. As I recall, Thomas Edison used to take frequent naps in his laboratory while he was working on inventions.
Right, absolutely.
And I think he would come out of a nap and all of a sudden there would be an idea.
Right. Getting dropped those packets of information. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Although I know in Edison's case, at least with regard to the light bulb, he experimented with thousands of different types of filaments before he discovered that tungsten was the one that would work.
Right.
So, but he was a member of the Theosophical Society. I wouldn't be surprised if there are other inventions. In fact, now that I think about it, I once received a great deal of funding from an inventor named Buck Charlson. He invented power steering and the hydraulic motor, and he explained to me that those inventions sort of popped into his mind, fully formed. And I knew him in the 1990s, and at that time, he explained to me the hydraulic motor he invented was in the 1960s. He says it's worked so well, they haven't had to make any improvements since it was first invented.
Wow, that's amazing. We get emails like that all the time from people sharing their stories about how they've come to different pieces of information that have supported them in their lives in one way or another. I just got one the other day from someone who was working on their dissertation, and I think it was in chemistry, and they couldn't figure out this one piece of it, and then all of a sudden they visualized this structure and how it was all supposed to come together, and they were able to finish their dissertation. So it's fascinating.
Nikola Tesla is another inventor who it is said about him that his inventions came fully formed into his mind and they work perfectly.
Right. It's amazing.
Helane, it's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. I hope we have more in the future. You're a rare person who combines the scientific spirit with the pioneering spirit of an explorer.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. It is an honor.
Thank you for being with me. I look forward to many more conversations in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.